Unsupervised Learning, Redpoint's AI podcast. And today we have on Percy Liang, one of the world's leading AI researchers and co-founder of Together AI. And outside of founding Together, which is an AI unicorn, Percy has led some of the most innovative AI projects. In his work on generative agents, Percy created a virtual world similar to The Sims, where AI agents interact with each other, allowing researchers to study complex social dynamics. During the episode, we also got Percy's takes on the future of evals, why interpretability is so difficult, and the current state of AI research. Overall, this was an awesome episode with one of the leading minds in AI research. Don't forget to stick around for Pat and my debrief. Now here's Percy. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, I feel like there's a lot of places we can start, but I think, top of everyone's list these days is, OpenAI's new O1 model. And I'm curious, just your reaction to it. Is it a crazy breakthrough? Is it something that, what do you think when it came out?
Yeah. From a product perspective, I thought it wasn't very good. It was kind of slow. It was sort of hard to kind of use for many of the things I wanted. From a research perspective, I think this signals sort of a change that I think we'll see going into the future. And I think the idea of test time compute, it's been around, but I think as with many things, it needs sort of a certain kind of a scale for people to have it sink in. I think a lot of what we think about language models is prompt comes in, response comes out, people measure tokens per second and whatever, and everything happens within a few seconds. But I think that's really understanding the value and the potential of an AI being able to solve much more ambitious tasks that take on the order of days or weeks or even months, like kind of the big projects that we as humans take on. And I think directionally, at least, O1 is just like a very small step in that direction, but you can kind of see where the field could go is that you have these agents that can reason and plan and do things for quite some time and solve maybe ambitious, like come up with new research or invent new drugs and so on. One other thing I think is interesting is if you rewind 10 years ago, reinforcement learning was all the rage, AlphaGo, you remember that?
Of course.
And in the last 5 years or so, we've kind of almost forgotten about this because now it's large language models predict the next token. But I think we're kind of starting to see a shift where now these are, agents. I mean, we're using the same word even. We have agents that can take actions, and I think the way to interpret the generation of a language model is not necessarily text, but it's just actions in some space. And when you are embedding an agent in a larger task, when it's operating for a long time, then there's a possibility of getting more and more experience, and that experience with appropriate reward signal means that you can actually learn and iterate on that. So I think we'll see a lot more of agents being deployed in some tasks and getting feedback and actually making them better.
Yeah, super cool. I saw the LMSys, or there were some benchmarks around it that the O1 models were incredible at math, right? Or are there specific domains that you look towards, or okay, if it's really good at math or some of these other things, then that means it'll be better at these multi-step kind of agentic type workflows.
So my favorite new one is the benchmark that we just put out.
Okay.
It's called SciBench. It's basically capture the flag cybersecurity
that was
exercises. Cool. And these are crazy hard. I don't think I can solve most of them.
If you can't solve them, what hope goes for your mortals?
There's no chance.
Well, I'm not a cybersecurity expert either, but some of them, the hardest one takes a team of human competitors to over 24 hours to solve. And currently the models are able to solve the challenges where the first time that a team or a person has been able to solve is around 11 minutes or so. So there's quite a bit of a gap. So I think this is a challenging benchmark. So when people say benchmarks are being saturated, I was like, okay, well, why don't you take a look at this benchmark? So that's one thing that we tried O1. Actually, it was a little bit strange because, and this, I guess, points out the subtlety of evaluation. If we use it as a drop-in replacement, it actually doesn't really improve overall. Actually, it does improve in certain respects on kind of a subtask performance. So if you break down the task, then that gets better. But overall, it didn't. It wasn't like a huge bump. And I think the reason is that when we dropped it in as a replacement, we're treating it as not O1, but like a normal language model. So we have our own templates for how the agent should reflect and plan and do all these things. And O1 just ignored all of that. It just did its own thing and generated the answer. So it wasn't really compatible with our framework. So that's why I think the scores weren't as good. So I think if you spend we've spent more time or developed towards it, I think it could be better. But I think maybe this is just kind of a cautionary tale where if you just look at raw benchmark scores, it doesn't necessarily tell you the full story.
Yeah.
Another cautionary tale is that we have an idea of monotonic progress, but if you are using AI in a context of a larger system, there's sort of this compatibility that needs to be there for you to actually see the improvements. So if it doesn't fit in, then you're gonna just not get good results. So for everyone who's trying to use, O1 or any sort of new model that's coming out, I think the compatibility is something that's maybe not looked at as much.
I think it's a really interesting question what you alluded to around so many of these AI applications have come out on the GPT-4 level models, and they built all the scaffolding around it and kind of ways to chain things together in prompts. And it's I think it's a big question of will that stuff still be relevant for this next generation of models, or was that was all great scaffolding for the previous generation, and now it's a whole new set of things that you have to do.
I do think that a lot of that will change. I don't think we should be particularly proud of or attached to the scaffolding that has been built up so far. I mean, it's just like a chain of prompts. I mean, I think it's very dispensable. I think the paradigm might shift in a way which O1 kind of reveals that, right? So the idea of having all of that reasoning and scaffolding kind of internalized to the model, and furthermore, not exposing it to the user, I think that's going to be somewhat, actually, from a research perspective, kind of annoying, because if things go wrong, you just can't debug it. You don't see the trace, right? You don't get the stack trace in some sense, which might make it harder to actually for a developer to customize and develop applications. I think OpenAI's hope is that they will just take care of it.
Right.
And so,
I assume they don't want people to train on the step-by-step logic.
Yeah. There's competitive reasons why you don't want to do that. But I think there's this kind of tension here where, yes, when it does work, it'll be great. It will solve IMO problems. But when it doesn't, which is going to happen all the time because all the places where we didn't have data, or OpenAI didn't have data coverage, or you have some novel application, the ability to customize, I think, is important. And hopefully we'll talk about open weight and open source models a little later. But we're seeing that we're kind of losing that even with the closed models. Whereas before, if you have OpenAI GPT-4 and you had an application with a bunch of chains, at least the prompt was transparent and you had openness there. But now if that's getting internalized, then it's just a black box.
You mentioned kind of playing with O1 when it came to, obviously you've invented and been a key part of a lot of the benchmarks that people use. But what do you personally, the morning that O1 drops, what are you testing out to see if what it can and can't do?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. The AI developer doesn't actually, maybe use AI as much as one might think. I think that there's a few things you could kick the can around. I don't have a set of prompts. Sometimes it's just kind of trying whatever's on the top of my mind and looking at kind of tail behavior. I think the other thing is I do use ChatGPT for various things. And over the weekend I was trying to write this React app. I haven't used React in a long time, and so it was rather helpful. I actually used O1 and it was slow and kind of annoying, so I switched back to GPT-4. Because for that application, it doesn't.
Well, there's interesting use
matter.
Cases where you want immediate feedback, and you just want something that's fast, but it's okay if it's wrong. You're going to kind of steer it along the way.
So it's very multi-dimensional, cost, speed, accuracy, which task is it good on, is customizability. I think all of these facets matter, and so I think portraying it as a kind of one-dimensional, models are getting better, is a little bit of oversimplification.
That was interesting to see how obviously it's better on certain tasks, coding, math, but actually worse on others.
Which makes a lot of sense, because math and coding are the ones where these reasoning chains really help, and also you can get better supervision compared to other tasks.
Yeah. One thing I was struck by when we were preparing for this is I feel like your research and kind of all the things you spend time on, it's like the breadth is incredible, right? You're doing like a lot of different things. And I wonder like how you think about, obviously you said at Stanford, the role that like academia should have in AI research and how you prioritize, like where does it make sense where does it make sense for you to spend time, where doesn't it?
Yeah. I think this is a really good question. And often you hear kind of people in academia having this sort of existential crisis where GPT-4, GPT-4o or whatever, or 1 is coming out and my research is doomed. And I think, and it's totally unfair. They have more resources than us. How can
they
we
get tens of thousands of GPUs?
Yeah. And I think that's exactly right. If you kind of go head to head against OpenAI, it's just there's no point. So the point is that there should be another game you play. And I've thought about this quite a bit, and I think one of the key things is to be orthogonal, right? Mm-hmm. So it should be the case that whatever research project you pick, if GPT-4 or GPT-5, let's say GPT-5 comes out, it should either enhance your research or be like kind of irrelevant in some sense. So just to give a few examples, so we had this work on generative agents, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later, which would be enhanced. If the models get better, then the ability to use these models to create simulations of society will get better. And that's great because we're not interested in just the raw language model. We're interested in novel use cases of the language model. Again, another example, we have a benchmark on ability for a language model to solve machine learning, engineering tasks. And that's going to get better. So every time a new model comes out, that's very kind of exciting for those applications. Another direction I think academia could do more in is more thinking about the open source community. Because at the end of the day, open academia is about open science, right? Yeah. Which means that creating knowledge and putting out in the public domain. And while there is a lot of knowledge at a lot of these frontier labs, it's not in the public domain. So to think of major contribution is actually discovering, or even if it means reinventing, who knows, and publishing it, I think has a lot of benefits because it can get more easily taken up by the broader community, and you have new models and products and whatever being built on top of these ideas than if they were just in kind of one place.
Yeah.
So often, I think some of the things that we're doing about kind of understanding, data quality in pre-training, for example, or how to weight data is something that I think that, I don't know what the frontier labs are doing. Maybe they're doing something already, fairly, sophisticated, but having some of these ideas being out in open, I think is just in itself, I think is a, valuable contribution. And then there's a third category of works that we've been doing around, you could say it's either you could call it transparency or benchmarking or auditing. So I think academia stands as sort of a unique position where we don't have commercial interests. We're trying to develop things that are for the benefit of society or at least for the public good. And so when we benchmark, or we had a project that assesses the transparency of different providers, that work is extremely hard or almost impossible to do if it were in a kind of a commercial setting. So academia kind of makes sense from that perspective. And we have some collaborations with folks at the law school and other areas of campus where there are a bunch of unique kind of problems that come up when you look at a kind of academic context. So enough to keep busy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting what you were saying about choosing projects that are orthogonal to kind of the innovation of some of the big model players.
Yeah.
A lot of startups kind of
I was actually thinking about the same thing. It's not specific to academia.
Yeah, they take the similar approach of like, okay, we want GPT-5, 6, 7 to reinforce the advantage that we have.
Exactly. If a startup is betting against OpenAI's new model,
I think Sam explicitly said this though. Like everyone's always like, "What startup should I invest in?" He's like, the startup should be rooting for the models to get better.
Yeah, he did. Is there something kind of that you've obviously been in the AI world for years now. Is there anything that you've seen that kind of has completely changed in your mind and with regards to AI in the last few years?
So I think one thing that I've gotten to appreciate more is how to think more holistically about AI's role. I think a lot of AI researchers, because they come from kind of this more technical background, think of the model as the central object, right? And if you think, for example, in the context of AI safety, AI safety, I think, often gets construed as, here's a model, we're gonna make it safe by making sure that doesn't do bad things, it doesn't respond to harmful responses, harmful requests. And I think that's sort of missing a broader picture, which is that there's the model, but that's one small piece of a larger ecosystem of actors with different incentives doing things in the world. And what you're trying to do when you think about safety is make sure that the whole system is quote unquote safe, not the particular model. And I think this leads to a bunch of other interventions besides just RLHFing the model to death that I think are much more sensible. For example, a lot of bad actors can, I think, circumvent the safety by decomposing their problem. For example, if I wanted to send you a phishing email, I wouldn't go to a model and say I want to write a phishing email and declare my intent, and I would write a personalized email. I would say something like, this is the top 10 research papers you should read that really are going to be big. And then I go in and change all the links to whatever I want, right? So I think it's actually harder than people kind of give credit for to police some of these cases of misuse. And the other thing I think is that is defense, right? And I think there needs to be more invested in defense, just like with any dual-use technology,
Totally.
like email or the internet. It can be used for good, it can be used for ill, and we have anti-spam filters, we have anti-fraud detectors, and these things are essential. Otherwise, we have
email
a complete
work and
we have a complete mess. And I think the analog of that needs to also develop. That these tools will be out there, people will always be able to use them. I think it's a losing battle to try to gate access to these models because they'll get cheaper and they'll get widespread. But that doesn't mean we give up and throw our hands like, oh, it's impossible. There are measures that we can take to secure it. So I think thinking more holistically about how the whole ecosystem works as opposed to just focusing on what the model is doing. I think there's a limited amount of things you can do with the model.
And obviously, some of those measures can be taken by the model providers themselves or net new startups. But I think it's a good segue to talk a little bit about regulation because I think people are asking what role should regulators have in controlling some of these use cases. And you've seen things like the EU AI Act, and I know you've talked about it. I mean, there's a bunch of different facets to this. And I know you've talked a lot about there's obviously values encoded in models, and I'm curious how you kind of think about the regulatory landscape we have today and then what the ideal landscape to go to is. Hey, this is Jacob. This isn't an ad, but I wanted to quickly share more about our show. Our goal with unsupervised learning is to unpack how the best AI operators make day-to-day decisions and where the space is headed. Through these conversations, we hope to shine light on what's working versus not and what's real versus hype in the world of AI. If you're enjoying this episode with Percy, please consider subscribing on whatever platform to support the show, and share with a teammate if you think they'd benefit. I'm curious how you kind of think about the regulatory landscape we have today and then what the ideal landscape to go to is.
Yeah, this is a complex topic, and I should also say that I'm not an expert.
Sorry, we definitely aren't either.
But I will say that the stance I've always taken is that it is really early, and there's a lot that we don't understand. And I sort of get the desire. We need to regulate. We don't want to, have repeat social media or whatever. But I think there are things that you can do that are potentially bad, like SP1047, for example. And just to say a bit more, I think I am very much pro kind of regulation that emphasizes transparency and disclosure. Because I think the first step to gating something is to just understand the risks and also the benefits and basically what's happening. And I think that currently there is everything is so kind of closed off that it's hard to get a sense for policymakers or researchers or third-party auditors to really understand what the what's happening. So having more evaluations and I think make a lot of sense. I think the other piece of regulation is where should you regulate, kind of upstream or downstream? Do you regulate foundation model developers, or do you regulate the end products? And clearly we have regulation for the various we have in finance and healthcare we have sectoral regulation already, and I think in some sense that's where the most effective you can see kind of what the harms are. I think the problem with regulating like in a heavy-handed upstream is that it's sort of might be either ineffective or it's kind of it's a very blunt way to do things. But having transparency and obligations for allowing the downstream decision makers to make sense of what's coming down the pipe, I think is totally reasonable. Just like when we think about it as like nutrition labels for food and other devices having spec sheets, and I think a lot of that is necessary so that downstream product developers have an idea of what's happening.
But I guess transitioning to some of your research, like I feel like one of the ones that I found most compelling was this, generative agents work you did, where I'm sure this is butchering it from a simplicity standpoint, but I thought of it as like you kind of created this Sims-like environment where basically, all these agents are interacting with each other. It's like a fascinating way to study social dynamics. I mean, can you talk a bit about that work and kind of what's next for it?
Yeah. So generative agents, wow, that came out last year.
Well, it's dog years in AI, so we'll call it
dog years in AI. So, but I think it's still directionally relevant. And the main thing we were interested in kind of going into this is work with my student June Park and Michael Bernstein, and the from an AI perspective, I think one thing that's fascinating is we think about language models classically as generating text, right? But text is could be a document, could be a piece of code or something. But what other things can you generate? Can you generate essentially an agent or a society of agents? And that's sort of the thing that sort of triggers our imagination. What if you could do this? And so we built this set of agents. Each agent was powered by a language model with an intricate set of prompts and grounded in this kind of virtual environment where agents could actually move around and talk to each other. And I think that was a really fun project because it was pure kind of exploration.
Yeah.
Right. It was like, we don't know what's going to happen. Let's build it and see and simulate and see. And it was kind of interesting that many of the phenomena that you see in social dynamics crop up, like information diffusion, where one person talks to another. One person was announced they were running for mayor, and he talks and tries to convince other people, and so on. So I think that was really kind of, you can call it kind of emergent behavior. So I think going forward, one gap that needs to be filled is, while generative agents was about creating believable simulations, so you look at it, it's like, looks good, but I think if you could get simulations that were actually valid in the sense that they reflected something in reality, then I think you unlock a lot of different new vistas. And while believability, I think, is sufficient for, let's say, games, and that's going to be its thing, I think a lot of the potential for having essentially a digital twin of society in some sense, I think would be allow you to run policy experiments. Like, for example, let's say, COVID mask policy. Let's do this and see what happens with agents, or we're going to create this law and see what happens. And of course, I think we're still a bit away from having, being able to trust these things. But if we, bet on these models getting better, in the future, we might be able to actually simulate many of the decisions that we would make, and also even just being able to do social science studies where you have to recruit a set of participants, and often it's very slow and expensive,
and always just on college kids. So
college kids. So if you could get them on a much more demographically diverse build a demographically diverse set of agents, you can actually also do things. One thing I really like is that you can give someone both the treatment and the control.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Which you can't do
because they have the same kind of underlying model, and then you say, put this model.
Well, you just give them the one A, and then you reset, you wipe their memory, and then give them B. And so you get really kind of clean kind of control. Obviously, this is just in simulation.
Yeah.
But I think you can use this as a sort of a first pass to, get some ideas, and then do the actual studies.
It's so interesting. They're actually, even for clinical trials right now in medicine, they're trying to do this digital twin type work where it's like you give someone the treatment, but then kind of simulate what would have happened to them if they'd stayed on the control.
Yeah.
What an awesome, I think that's a fascinating set of applications. You could imagine also like org design within a company and like simulating a bunch of different ways and seeing what happens.
Yeah. So I think there's two types of agents. I think both are fascinating. The first agent is more what we talked about earlier, agents like O1 that are able to perform really difficult tasks. And the other type of agent is more like about simulation. So it's not about performing a particular task per se, but kind of mimicking what a human is doing or individual is doing. And I think the latter is maybe less studied, but I think it has a whole host of new kind of potential applications that we're not really looking at right now.
Totally. What makes kind of that type of simulation so different than the type of simulation that people have been doing in the past? I guess people would model diseases or things like that, but I guess that wasn't really in the context of each agent has their own kind of decision making and model of the world, and then they're all going off and interacting with each other.
So clearly simulations have been around for a long time. Often it's, if you think about like physical simulations, weather simulations, those are governed by, physics or some equation, or like generative agent-based modeling is a area where people create very stylized and simplistic models. You have to simplify. The system has to be simple. But for the first time, because we have these models, you can actually simulate something in much greater detail than was ever possible. So that's a sort of thing that is potentially an unlock.
Do you think before we make like major life decisions in the future, we'll run these simulations and like see how they play out?
I think
hopefully we can do that with potential investments. What happens if we invest
there's an application for you. Killer app right there. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think even now, right? I think you could simulate. Let's say you're going to, go, do a podcast, for example. I didn't actually do this, but you could have, ask, a language model to simulate what the interview would say, or I'm sure people, before they go on a date, they'll use it as practice or whatever. And I think there's a lot of, potential applications or benefits from being able to do, accurate, simulations. But I will say that, we have to be very careful that, the simulation currently is still, quite far, or we don't know how close they are to the real thing.
Yeah.
Such interesting work. Another, switching gears to other parts of your work, you obviously spend a lot of time working on evaluations. We were talking about some of it earlier. I'd love just kind of maybe giving our listeners some context on like your thoughts on the state of evals today, and then what happens as we get more and more of these. Obviously a lot of this has been built to benchmark LLMs, and now we have more like agentic models. Are we going to need a whole new? You obviously talked about some of the capture the flag work you've done. Where are we kind of headed?
Yeah, I mean, evaluations is exciting, but also a huge mess right now. I think it used to be so much easier before, right? You have these data sets, there would be a train set and there would be a test set, and then you train and you test and you get some number, and then you'd be done. But the one big problem right now is the train test overlap, right? We have no idea what's actually in the training data, and they won't, the companies won't tell us either. So there's always any evaluation that I run, I constantly wonder, okay, how do I trust this? And even if they didn't train on it exactly, it's, maybe it was something similar. Was it like a lot of, word problems of a certain type? So I think that's just like hanging over everyone's, head. That said, I think that evaluation is a constantly moving target, because I think as models get better, there's new things that we want the models to do that are not captured by existing benchmarks. And so one thing I've been really excited about is how you can use language models themselves to benchmark language models, of course.
Of course. Well, at some point they're going to be so capable that we couldn't possibly come up with like the latest frontier.
Yeah. So, and in particular, getting at this idea of coverage, right? So what's really interesting about these models is that they claim they can do anything. Like, ask me any instruction, we'll follow it. And I think so. It's unlike classic benchmarking where you have just one task. And because it's so diverse, I think it's really nearly impossible for someone to sit down and it's like, okay, we're going to think about all the tasks. And even if you have user data, I think user data doesn't maybe stress some of the kind of the tails as much. But language models, you can get them to invent all sorts of things. We had a paper called AutoBencher that looks at how you can basically generate automatic inputs in a way that leverages some side information. So the language model that is generating the question has some piece of information that the test taker doesn't know. So you can use this asymmetry to get more sensible evaluation. Otherwise, you're just like evaluate. So self-evaluation, I think, is not trivial, but I think you want this extra layer of kind of protection. Another thing I've been thinking about in terms of evaluation is I feel like a lot of evaluation right now kind of relies on fairly superficial judgments. Like you have A and B, and A is a long piece of text and B is a long piece of text, and you just say, oh, B is better than A. But that feels so unsatisfying. And what I like to do is think more, I guess, having taught for a while, when we grade exams, we have idea of a rubric, right? So that we provide a standard for evaluation where any kind of student response or I guess in this case LM response is subject to the rubric. So that anchors the evaluation in sort of more concrete terms, as opposed to is this good or not? Well, tell me what I should be looking for. Yeah. So, but overall, I think that evaluation landscape will I think need to evolve quite a bit beyond kind of these standardized benchmarks, which everyone says like, oh yeah, we don't trust the benchmarks or whatever, but we should do something with it.
Yeah, and it makes sense that obviously, sitting in academia is actually a great place to be to develop like an objective set of benchmarks that work for the industry. And then I think we'll also see, a ton of like vertical specific benchmarks where like we don't care if our model is amazing at like, the cutting edge math problems, just like can it diagnose a medical image or do whatever.
So one thing that has happened, 2 years ago we put out HELM, Holistic Evaluation of Language Model, which is trying to cover all the different aspects kind of manually. And what has happened is that Helm has become more of a framework, and we've looked at different types of, you could say verticals. That, for example, we have a benchmark that looks at safety evaluations. We have another Helm leaderboard for a tie, another one for so there's different languages that you might be interested. There's we're doing one for medical and one for finance. So I do think that it makes sense that in any given vertical there's actually quite a bit to do, and developing something that's more tailored towards that setting makes a lot of sense.
And speaking of verticals, I mean, some of these, especially regulated industries, I think a problem they have with LLMs is just how black box it all is. And I know you've worked on interpretability before, and I can't tell whether interpretability at this point is like a lost cause because like these models are so complex and we have so little knowledge of what's going on in them, or like how do you think that evolves for as these models make diagnoses or credit decisions, like the ability to kind of understand?
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack here, and I feel like the problem is exacerbated. So when we started working on interpretability back in 2017, this at least you got the model weights and you got the training data. You could look at that, and even then, it was hard to understand why is this model making this prediction, because deep learning is difficult to work with. And now on top of that, we don't often with the models we don't have the weights, we don't have the data, so it adds another layer of sort of obfuscation, as if it weren't hard enough already. So that's kind of the world we're living in. In terms of what interpretability means, I think there's a school of or thought or a body of work around mechanistic interpretability, which tries to really understand the individual neurons inside a network and make sense of what's happening. I find that I think it's very interesting when you discover this neuron is responsible for this particular style. It's more, I think, about science. I think interpretability has two audiences. One is about kind of just scientific understanding. You're just curious what is going on, and the other is like you said in regulated industries. If it makes a decision and you want to know why it's making a decision, or you're developing a model and you just care like to debug and fix the problem. I think there's other things. So for example, in 2017, we worked on influence functions as a way to attribute why a model makes a prediction in terms of other training examples. And this work has been adapted to language models, but it's very difficult to scale.
That's like I made this decision because I saw these 10 examples. Like which basically the idea is which training examples were most influential for making this prediction. And the thought experiment is, if I had an example and I removed it from the training set, would I still make the prediction? If it wouldn't, then that says this example was influential. If it basically didn't change anything, then this example doesn't matter. I mean, there's problems with how you both compute this and how you interpret this, but that is one flavor of interpretability that I think is useful. Now, of course, if your training data is private, then I think it's you don't want to have you got diagnosed with disease because this guy over here got
because this random Reddit thread.
So I think it's difficult. And another tack on interpretability is explanations. So you can do chain of thought and it generates some explanations, but there's all this work that shows explanations are not maybe exactly what actually is happening.
Kind of like people.
Kind of like people. So at least I think maybe with the agent architecture explanations, you can think about it as at least a bottleneck for if you have things which are more modular, then and all they get transmitted is explanations, then at least kind of what how the pieces are moving.
So we may when there's open models that do kind of similar things to one, and you can see the steps, you may have an ability to explain how something came about.
But I think where I'm at with interpretability is, in order to even do interpretability, we need to have the weights and the the training data.
Yeah.
So you can get back to like 2017 era level of access. And then you can answer a lot of these questions.
Maybe one other question on the research side before we move on to Together and all the other amazing things that you've been up to. And this is more just because I'm very curious. There's been kind of Transformer and then Mamba and then these different model architectures. One, I guess, how enduring do you think those will be? And then two, when new model architectures come out, is that due to breakthroughs in math or experimentation, or like where did those come about? I think back to, there was like the vanishing gradient problem, and then people were like, we need to get actually more data back to these other parameters, and so then we're gonna make some new adjustments for that. But I don't know, is it like math or experimentation, or how are people coming up with these new model architectures?
Yeah, so historically, a lot of the architectures like LSTMs and ConfNets and transformers were intuition.
Yeah,
you train and you think about the gradients and how that should work, and some experimentation. I think what's interesting maybe about the Mamba or state space models line of work is that it came actually from math. It was Albert and Chris Ray and some people trying to answer the question of if you have a sequence of points, how do you fit a kind of an online update on the best polynomial fit? So it was like kind of just math. They solved the problem, and then they figured out how to get it to actually work at scale and inside a neural net, which is kind of interesting because even though the math doesn't apply to the actual model, but it was a source of inspiration for the actual architecture. In terms of where all these architectures go, I don't have terribly strong opinions about this. I don't really do architecture stuff, but it is. I guess bet on transformers and all these things not being the one that we kind of continue using in the future, just because it's sort of arbitrary and you can change it. Whether there will be super large changes, I think that remains to be seen. I think that maybe more interesting is if you have other kind of regimes, for example, video. I think that's where maybe you'll more likely see kind of innovations there, because you can't just do the naive thing of a giant transformer, or if you have, let's say, now we're kind of in this more agent searchy setting. Maybe there's other architectures that are more amenable and fit in fit better in the mold of a kind of a larger system.
Yeah.
But I think structurally something has to change for something really new to come out. For example, in Vision, if you just want to do very simple image classification, ConfNets are totally fine. Right. And so transformers wouldn't have, I think, been invented unless people really tackle machine translation, which is a much different problem. So I think if you look at maybe different types of problems are a good way to look for kind of where architectural innovations will happen.
Super interesting. I mean, I guess one other hat you wear obviously is you're the co-founder of Together. And one thing I'm struck by is obviously this kind of new O1 paradigm of test time. All kind of trying a lot of these different scenarios. Seems like it has big implications for the inference market, right? It's quite different than this current setting. And so, what impact do you think that has? Are a lot of these breakthroughs like flash tension and whatnot still relevant for this new class of models, or what happens to the inference market with this? This change?
Totally. I mean, I feel like I would see inference as a sort of a very low-level primitive that you just need to get right. You need to make it robust. You need to make it cheap. And that's a lot of what Together focuses on right now, because in some sense everything needs inference. If you train a model, you need forward passes inference. If you are doing any sort of agentic flow, you're doing inference. If you're generating synthetic data to further tune the model, you're doing inference. So I think it's more of a building block that needs to be stable. But of course, I think over time, you think about what inference for what, and then you start maybe operating on a different abstraction. For example, a lot of the inference market right now is serving Llama 3 essentially, and but why are we serving Llama 3? Because it's a good model, but why Llama 3? Why not a different model? And I think that what I think we'll see is people wanting to serve models that basically, what do people care about? The people care about the models work for whatever their use case is. They don't care if it's Llama 3. Llama 3 just gives a sort of a stamp of approval that this is not a total sucky thing. But over time, I think what's interesting is that if you can adapt the model to a particular use case, you can potentially get way much faster and better performance over time. And also I think the sort of agentic workflows and all that open up opportunities for maybe further optimization. For example, if you have the high throughput setting, if you want to just generate a huge number of possibilities and do then that is something that you could kind of optimize for. So the inference, I guess, optimizations could definitely take into account what's happening sort of at the level.
I just see from a together perspective, you think of inference optimization as this prerequisite to then do all this really interesting work around some of these other areas too.
So together, the story is you need GPUs.
Totally.
And that's the lowest level. And then you need inference. And then you have the ability to fine tune and what we think of as basically kind of customizing models. Because I think I think generally pretty hard to take say Llama 3, 4, or 5B and say, I want to make it 10 times faster and it's still going to do everything that the original model. But if you say, okay, take this one, I don't know, whatever, call center application, and you're going to do it a lot of times, I think there's much more room for kind of squeezing out performance.
You alluded to this earlier that we're kind of it feels like we need some sort of algorithmic breakthrough or change from transformers to get to the next step of reasoning or, I guess I'm curious, what milestones are meaningful to you? People talk about reasoning as this kind of broad term. Yeah. And what are the meaningful milestones to you? And I guess to ask a shameless question, how far away do you think we are if you're predicting from some of these milestones?
Well, I think just starting, let's say, with the benchmarks that we have, like SciBench for cybersecurity or ML Agent Bench for solving ML research tasks. I think these are still good trackers of performance because performance is well below kind of what it could be. I think that so that's one way to kind of track progress in the near term. I think that and of course we'll continue developing benchmarks over time. But if you want to kind of go farther out, solving some kind of really open, let's say solving an open math problem, we're doing something that is really beyond what humans, basically anything that extends human knowledge, I think is really, really interesting. Because a lot of what AI has been about is catching up with humans in some sense, right? You're mimicking humans. And I think we're sort of getting past that point where now we're mimicking expert humans. But all of this stuff, like solving IMO problems, well, people have already done, clearly people have done that because people made the problem. But if you can actually create something that's really, discover something new, like create new research or solve something that hasn't been solved, then I feel or even in a cybersecurity case, find a 0 day, then I think that's kind of a game changer.
And do you feel like we're in I feel like everyone's asking, are we getting to some plateau of model capabilities, or does it feel like we're still on this crazy exponential?
I think things are still moving up pretty quickly. I think locally it's always feels like maybe things are, locally everything's linear in some sense, but I think it's maybe going to be more than just naive scaling, like, oh yeah, of course models will get bigger, more data and whatever, but I think there will be qualitative changes as well. Like for example, different, like O1 kind of represents a little bit of a different way that you might think about using these systems. And of course on top of that, chips are going to get more powerful and cheaper, so that's going to still kind of drive the whole thing.
I mean, another category of models you spent time in is, you worked on open source models for robotics. And I think, there are a lot of varying opinions on where we are in like robotics foundation models and, if we're close to some sort of ChatGPT moment in that space. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we're definitely not at a ChatGPT moment for robotics today. I think we are closer to a kind of BERT era moment for robotics, where the idea of using vision language models, fine-tuning them, and getting for foundation models for robotics is effective. But you still have to fine-tune them, and then fine-tune them for narrow tasks, and the resulting policies are still like very brittle in ways that that it's not the case in language.
Yeah.
So I think it will be a few more years. I think the good news is that there's a lot more kind of interest and, I guess funding and everything for this. And, there's a bunch of other data collection efforts. So I think things are moving, but, I think hardware is hard. So it will maybe take some amount of time. But I'm optimistic that things will. I don't see any fundamental obstacles, like we can't get to a ChatGPT moment for robotics.
I guess just there's no internet of data available to
you just have to do the hard work. You have to do it the hard way.
Yes. And I think it's still, you're betting on emerging capabilities that until they emerge, it's hard to know when and how they might.
Yeah. I guess one thing that's maybe good is that we can lean on language and vision to basically sort of driving all the architecture and data and kind of the compute recipes, so that when we have the right data and for problem formulation for robotics, like we have infrastructure that we can just borrow. And furthermore, I think that my hope is that a lot of the so-called robotics problems are actually just language and vision problems. So if you can factor out a lot of that stuff, then you can potentially make robotics a lot more efficient.
Totally.
Like you shouldn't need robotics data to learn like what a cup is. You need robotics data to figure out how to like manipulate and grasp a cup, but just identifying a lot of the high level stuff, like that should all be language and videos.
Yeah. One thing I think that's interesting about your background is I understand you're quite a talented classical musician, and I guess there's been a lot of really interesting developments in like the AI music world, Suno and UDO and all these companies. Like as someone who is really passionate about music, like where do you think that space goes?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think certainly the same recipe, train a giant transformer on data is effective there. I think there are a few things that are challenging for music. One is I think copyright is a kind of a much bigger hurdle there. So that's a whole can of worms. The other thing is I think thinking about control. And so I had a postdoc in my lab, John Thixton, who worked on foundation models for music, and the emphasis there was on models that you can actually control. We don't want to just have unconditional generation or even just textual generation and having it just generate the music. Felt like it wasn't giving artists enough control over like what it was happening. And so we basically built this sort of generalized infilling model where it's called an anticipatory music transformer. So you can condition on any subset of the musical events in a score. You can condition on the melody, generate the harmony. You can condition on one part and fill in sort of a section.
Cool.
And I think one direction that this could go is basically like a co-pilot for musicians to basically, like composers or artists to create their works. Just like, I think people use GitHub Copilot. I think that's one area that I think is, pretty, interesting. And yeah, in terms of, how it intersects with my, personal musical aspirations. I think that, many years ago, I was, trying really hard to compete in these piano competitions, but I was doing this while doing a PhD. So it was like, I don't have enough time to practice. But I had these musical ideas on, like, I just wanted to sound like this. I know what I want, but my fingers won't do it. And so at a personal level, I'd be really excited of, how can these tools really help me realize my musical vision. And, I it's not like I'm going to be lazy and not practice, but just that it's sort of a augmentation to, and I think, I'm not sure what that would look like exactly, but I think, because I play, classical music, it's certainly very far away from like just pushing a button and having, just some music come out. There's a lot of subtleties, and also classical music, there isn't that much data for, so I think there's going to be some challenges there.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I imagine these like AI piano teachers in the future too. I know everyone always has complex relationships with their initial piano teachers, and so I think that'll be fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, like AI, on the point of teachers, they can be extremely good, like teachers, coaches.
Totally.
The use in education, I'm very kind of bullish, or we're just excited about.
Yeah. It's really cool when you see even those GPT-4 demos of like, drawing a math problem and then having it explained.
Those are really impressive.
It's really cool.
Yeah. I use it for teaching my kids like all the time. How do I explain this concept, which I know, and then now I need to explain it to a 5-year-old.
It's so good at that, and just breaking down complicated things and making them simple. It's very impressive.
Yeah. Well, we always like to end our interviews with a quick fire round where we get your take on a few things. And so maybe to kick it off, what's one thing that's overhyped and underhyped in AI today?
Agents and agents.
Yeah, I feel like we've gone through a full hype cycle and then some with agents.
Agents, they've been on both sides of the question.
You've written about like, ML agents doing their own ML research before. I'm curious, like obviously people always talk about this as some hypothetical step in the path to AGI. How far away from that do you think we are?
From AGI or?
No, sorry, from ML agents like contributing novel insights into ML work.
Yeah, it depends on how you think about what novel is, but I don't think we're very far from, to the extent that if you run, and I know this is supposed to be a quick round.
I show with a shamelessly broad question. This is where we sneak in all of our
I was laughing in my head because I was like, did you just ask about AGI in the fire round?
Yeah, usually it's like a yes or no question. So depends on what you mean by novel knowledge. But to the extent that having an agent that runs an experiment, that fills in some sort of runs a Bayesian experiment to answer some question, I think we can do that already. And now the question is how, maybe you can think about it at the level of, a very junior student, and then how can the model actually come up with maybe new experiments to run, and then take on maybe brainstorming new directions. I'm optimistic that you can actually do it and, do something and meaningfully in the next, years. I mean, just if you think about coding, right? Certainly, it has created new code and helped people code, and that's maybe a kind of simpler version. So I think the same thing will happen to research. I don't think it's it's that different.
Totally.
What application areas do you feel like are underexplored right now on top of these models?
I think classically a lot of AI applications driven by commercial needs, right? Everyone wants their RAG solution to question answering and summarization and so on. But potentially more kind of fundamental science and scientific discovery, improving researcher productivity. I think these are obviously not as well studied. But I think are important because they can feed into the whole cycle of improving the whole ecosystem.
Pat, that was a fun one.
Super fun.
So do I understand correctly that you took Percy's class?
I did take Percy's class. I took CS 221, which was kind of the first AI class that is offered. So yeah, I took his class back in the day.
I feel like even just from that recording, I can tell he was probably a very good professor.
He is a very good teacher. And the class was very well done. For sure.
No, that's awesome.
What were the takeaways for you, or what stood out to you?
I love this work that he did around generative agents and this kind of like Sims world that he created. And these, when you throw a bunch of agents at each other, these things that emerge of what they start doing and how they start interacting with each other.
Totally.
And I loved his idea that like, in the future we'll have a bunch of, agent twins that you can simulate, a policy or even, he talked about dating, and I was thinking about that Black Mirror episode where like you simulate a bunch of dates with a ton of people and figure out like who's the right person.
Totally.
For you. You can imagine instead of dating apps, you just like send your digital
Send
twin
your
out
agent
there
to go do the work for you.
Yeah. You're like, that looks like it was a fun date with that person. But that one, I don't know if I want to go on.
Yeah, that whole take on simulation was really interesting, of just what that could mean for the future. If you can actually simulate how humans or agents would speak or communicate or behave in these different worlds, I thought was really fascinating.
I feel like there's always been this like dream of central planning and like government figuring out like how to have every lever move in like the economy, and it never works. And then you're like, well, I wonder if these agents get better and better, whether at least government would be more informed in being able to project how things might go.
I thought it was really interesting what he was saying about having academic research be orthogonal to the progress that the model vendors are making. And we talked about this in the episode being similar to startups, but I just thought it was interesting kind of how he was approaching that from a practical standpoint. When you think about how many more resources a Google or OpenAI, or at least compute resources, may have than Stanford and some of the other academic institutions. So figuring out where they can still push the envelope, and that kind of dovetailed into one of the things that he mentioned around AI research and thinking through the whole system versus just the model, and that's kind of changed over time as these models have gotten into the real world. And so I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, I love that like he's telling his students what like VCs tell founders, but just like be in the path of progress of the models. Like you should want GPT-5 to come out and be really good, because that then makes your work even better. And
totally.
I think it's like for any type of work, whether it's academic or company building or whatnot, being on the path of progress toward that, I think ends up being super important.
Totally.
He just does so many different things. Like I felt like all the work he's done around evals, obviously, I think Helm is kind of one of these clear benchmarks, and now it feels like the capture the flag work he's doing as well. I love this idea that like we're getting to a point of model capabilities where we may just need like models to write evals for models.
Evals,
It's like you and I couldn't figure out how to like they're smarter than us, but
I mean, the capture the flag is a really cool example that's very easy to understand, and you can see how that would be a good test of model capability. Okay, there's some objective out there. How long does it take you to reach that objective? And so I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, and then I think generally his takes on O1, which I feel like has taken the space by storm in the last week. And obviously, I think his point that it's kind of like this first step of running much more compute at Inference and figuring out simulating a bunch of different steps, and how we've come full circle with AlphaGo and a lot of that work. But I think it also obviously presents challenges to academia, because OpenAI is hitting the steps, right?
Yeah.
And so what's actually going on behind the scenes is hard to study. It makes it hard for interpretability. And so, I wonder when we'll see an open source equivalent. But, he got me thinking that actually, from an interpretability standpoint for some of these industries like healthcare or finance, like this actually might be a step in a good direction, because at least the model is explaining step by step
what it's doing along the way.
And that actually could be helpful, rather than trying to identify the one in 70 billion neurons that's driving something.
Yeah, totally. I thought his take on the transformer and model architecture was interesting, and we've heard this from other people, but kind of this belief in future model architectures, and he seemed to think that would come from video or different domains that we're going to be pushing the existing architectures to break. I thought that was pretty interesting. I also thought it was cool that maybe this is just the nerd in me coming out, but that Mamba was actually driven by a math breakthrough.
Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating that they were actually like sitting down and looking at the math of how these things work, and then that led to new.
Did you understand the math he was saying? Because it completely
Definitely not.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was like, you had the master's from Stanford. You might have gotten it. For me, I was like, I'll just nod along here.
There is some important math, which it seemed like influenced the model architecture, but no, it's been a long time since I have done any real math. Although I appreciated his very subtle calculus hint, which was if what did he say? When you're looking locally, everything looks linear.
Yeah, exactly. Like that, I got still have that.
There you go.
Maybe we'll ask one of these, really complex reasoning models to explain to us what in the world happened.
Yeah, like we're a 12-year-old.
Exactly. I'm younger for me.
Yeah. What'd you think of his music AI take, or how he thinks about AI in the music world?
I love this idea that there's like something, in your head that you can't quite get out into the world, and that like there's a way to communicate that to AI that enables you to.
Yeah.
And I think it's this co-pilot vision rather than just one prompt and you have a song or a picture or something, that like there is something that you want to create, and not all of us can practice 6 hours of piano a day to get there, or go to art school or do whatever, but like, can you still express that creativity within you? I thought that was, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, people like Percy may have beautiful songs in their head. I feel like if I would need a lot more than AI to help me get the
Pat,
songs that are in my head down.
Shake It Off for the 17th time.
Exactly. Why do you keep coming up with Taylor Swift songs? We brought up Taylor Swift.
It's actually contractually obligated that in our debriefs it comes up in one way or another.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really fun episode with Percy. Folks should definitely stay tuned next week. I know we have a pretty sweet line of guests coming up.